So today he's going to tell us something about the policy-making process within the OECD, and I think he's going to tell us even more about how SPRU may be able to get involved in some of these activities. Thank you, Perry.
Thank you, Perry. Okay, well, Perry just told you everything I was going to tell you. I was just going to walk you through my life history and tell you interesting anecdotes, but now I'll have to think of something else instead. Now, I said I'd talk about challenges and future directions in science and technology policy. And I did have a set of slides all prepared on what these challenges might be and how the research policy analyst world could approach them. And some of those I was going to use yesterday, because yesterday I had to give a talk, one of two opening speeches at the meeting of the European Space Agency, which was looking at the future and what the role of the space sector might be, and particularly the challenges which new technologies might bring. And the first person to give the first opening address was the head of BEPA, which advises the European President. And he basically walked through every grand challenge there is, and by the end of it, the audience was almost asleep. And so I was able to throw away most of my slides instantly because it was just repetition of what he'd been saying. Luckily, I had some slides left which were focusing on particular things which the Space Agency was interested in particular marine economy, what's happening in the Arctic, and food security. So I focused on those, and thankfully he didn't. But it made me think today about what I was going to do and how I was going to do it. So I shuffled things slightly. So if this works. I'm pressing the down button. Yep. Aha, okay. I did have challenges and future directions in SDI policy, but then I changed it, or added how to change the world in 80 days. I was going to put 80 years, but sort of that's too long. But essentially, what I want to talk about is how people like yourselves can change things. How you can influence how policymakers think, and how, in turn, policymakers can and should make you think about the research which you should be doing. So it's that interchange, that interplay between the analyst community and the policy community about practice and theory in science and technology policy that I want to talk today. And I'll get round to the future challenges towards the end. So this is the map. A quick walk through the evolution of STI policy. A section which looks at from theory to practice, and I'll talk about EU policy developments over the last 10 years in particular. And then from practice to theory, I'll talk about the OECD and how policy needs shape OECD work programs and future research agendas which you could be interested in. And then a little bit at the end about careers in STI policy and opportunities for the younger amongst you, and even for some of the older ones. There's still the odd jolly to go on every now and again. Okay, this I won't go into in detail. This is just a picture. STI policy has been around for a long time, focusing on, I would say, science policy. Just look at the change in focus from science policy, science and technology, science, technology, innovation. And nowadays you have to think of science, technology, innovation and markets. Policies are expanding. You cannot separate the innovation policy from industrial policy now, from market developments, etc. You're thinking about how policy mixes develop. So a big change in the focus of science, technology, innovation policy, and also the reach. You're now having to consider much more global governance structures for science, technology, policy innovation. Some historical drivers of change. We know curiosity drives science. The need to fund that curiosity-driven science is still a large funder for the funding of research. Societal need has been there. I have some long, wonderful, interesting tales about how societal need has driven things really from the early days of astronomy. And competition, because one of the largest drivers of policy historically has always been the cry the French are coming, the Germans are coming, the Japanese are coming, the Russians are coming. This is something which has driven policy in the UK and the US and everywhere else in the world. But I won't focus there. Again, these are current drivers of policy change. You can see that one thing which really is influencing things at the moment. All things, they're exogenous things, financial crisis currently exercising everybody, globalization patterns, regional disparities, the grand challenges. These are the things exercising policymakers everywhere. But they're also endogenous drivers of change within the science, technology, innovation system themselves. New S&T developments, new developments in ICT in particular, are shaping the way science is done, technology is done, and what the dynamics of the interactions are between all the actors. New forms of innovation too. We're not just talking about technological innovation now when you're talking about policy. And there are appreciation now when people are thinking more systemic terms about what the performance weaknesses are on a system basis and whether they need to be addressed, and what the policy deficits are, critiques of policies. The rise in evaluation over the past 20, 30 years focuses attention on the weaknesses of certain policy mechanisms. This is just a useful acronym if you're ever asked to write an essay on what are the things which people have to take into mind now when we're talking about the dynamics of innovation systems, because there's vast changes in all of these. I'm a strong believer in mnemonics. I can never remember them without them. So this is just one list for you. This is a diagram, frequent to many, produced by an ex-SPRU member of staff, a graduate of Sussex University, an English literature graduate, if I remember rightly, but sort of early member of SPRU. He contrasts here developments on the theory side, in terms of here it's the early movement and shift from technology push to needs pull to coupling models. And on the policy side, some of the big things which were happening on the policy front. And Eric Arnold has written sort of fairly extensively about some of these interactions. And I'm just going to talk a little bit more about some of them, because next is another thing which is from a SPRU person. This is Ben Martin, whom you all know. His inaugural professorial speech I draw upon extensively when talking to people about what science policy has done and how it is influencing things in the future, because it's through the work that's been done here has altered so much the way that policymakers think about everything in the science, technology, innovation world. And I'm only going to talk here about one of them. But it's reviews like this, and Ben tells me he's now produced another one on 20 policy challenges, which I'm looking forward to reading. But I'm going to talk about one of them, and in particular how it shaped things on an EU front. I'm going to look at the one in red, individual actors. We now think in terms of systems. We don't think in terms of individual actions and policies which influence just individual actions. We started thinking in terms of big systems. This is another one drawn up by Stefan Kuhlmann and Eric Arnold, but based on many others' works. It's just a useful sort of way of looking at it. And you have, when you're thinking in these systems terms, to think of the concept of what are the different policy levers you have to pull to affect the different parts of this system. So you're starting thinking of policy mixes. When the term was first used, policy mixes was actually a polite description for policy muddle. Now this is a simple policy domain model which came to be used as a means of structuring country reviews of innovation policy within the EU. In the early 2000s, there was a series of exercises set up which looked at national systems of innovation, and this was the model which was used to structure the writing of those. Now, this was a model which had its origin in an expert group, a benchmarking expert group, which was chaired by Luc Serter, a former SPRU student, I was one of the rapporteurs for it responsible for this model, but there were 21 people on that expert group. 19 of them had passed through SPRU at some stage during their life. Unfortunately, there were no members of SPRU at that time on the panel. And this is something which hopefully will change in future. Now, those type of analyses of national innovation systems and the underpinning model of an innovation system were also used to really look at the EU as a whole. I was asked in early 2000s, there was a period when there was a national target, national targets were set for R&D. The people here will know it as the infamous 3% target. Unfortunately, the first time that appeared in a policy document of the EU, I was the person who put pen to paper on it. I don't like to be associated with it, to tell you the truth, simply because it was the result of an evaluation of the framework programs, a 5-year assessment of them. I was the rapporteur for that panel, and the chair of that panel was interested in making a big statement. And he'd been talking closely and was a friend of the commissioners, and irrespective of the results of the evaluation, he wanted this big statement in, and he wanted our countries to pay more for R&D. Unfortunately, when they got talking about numbers, the figure going round this committee of learned scientists, as opposed to policy analysts, was 10%. This was the first figure. Now, anybody who knows these figures knows that this is a nonsense figure. I raised the fact that it was currently at that stage 1.8%, and the chances of moving within 10 years to a figure of 10% was farcical. They brought it down first to 5%, so repeated hammering that this was farcical, and eventually they settled on 3%. And I insisted, this is absolutely crazy. 2.5% is the maximum that you could ever optimistically achieve, because you have all the accession countries just about to come in. They're going to lower the average for the EU as a whole, so it'll be, even getting back up to the 1.8, 1.9% is going to be a tremendous challenge. And the answer, infamous answer, and this is in the age of evidence-based policy making, was that no, 3%, 2.5% is not sexy. So it became 3%. 3% there, and unfortunately this figure was taken up and used in many other quarters, and we had to live with it. But at the end of all of that, the Commission, it was payback time, they asked me to be involved in setting up a number of expert groups to evaluate how the European Union could actually achieve these 3% targets. So I suggested that they had 5 expert groups, 4 of them covering different particular sets of policy implements, direct policy implement, indirect, 4 altogether, and an overarching group which would be comprised of the chairs and selected members of the other groups, called the policy mix group. And so that was put in place. I was asked to chair the policy mix group, and we produced an action plan for the 3%, which analysed the weaknesses of the innovation system. The same tactic that we used there was used later when I was asked to join the Innovation Union Task Force to write the Innovation Union communication policies, which now underpin the Horizon 2020 programme. And this was the kind of basis of it. And you can see whichever way that you looked at this kind of system between these interacting components, there were just weaknesses everywhere. There was no possibility of just addressing one of them, that all of them had to be tackled in that way. And so this was the policy response at the EU level. This is the structure of the EU communication at that time, which came out in 2011, I believe. These were policy aimed at improving performance at member states individually, and a whole set at the performance level. And if you look at the ones improving performance at an EU level, you'll see they cover most of the things which were talked about on the previous page in that system diagram. Now, that's the policy responses, and they were implemented in that, and we've seen them transformed into the Horizon 2020 type programs that you have now. There's still work to do there. What I've given you is an example now of how really policy analysts have fed the policy development process. You've gone from the theories evolved, I would say largely with a SPRU base, to tell you the truth, right from the early days in the 60s. Jeff Oldham can tell you about the contributions, the pre-SPRU contributions, Nesty, in the OECD, to the development of the Frascati manual, the positioning of science, technology, innovation as legitimate objects for study within the economic world, which was resistant to looking at the role of science and technology and innovation in those days, to the development, subsequently the development later on, again taking people from, many of them from SPRU who went back into the OECD, people like Bengt Arke Lundvall, like Luc Surter, who did stints at the OECD, set up the Technology and Innovation Policy Working Party, were responsible for influencing thinkings in that way. All of these thinking that in the national innovation system level, all of these build up over the years to sets of policies. When I look at the Innovation Union policies, when I was asked to collect the evidence, not personally going around from country to country, but just taking everything which had been written, all the evidence, all the people who were putting forward the policies within the Commission had to produce some evidence. I had to sift through that evidence to see whether there were clashes, duplications, whether there was a solid foundation. And it was amazing. It amazed me. It amazed me because I could recognize where most of these things were actually coming from. I could look back and think, Eric wrote that, Patrice wrote that, Jeff wrote that, Chris did this. I could just see where all these things were feeding in. And particularly odd was when sort of somebody comes up and asks, they've got something, and they ask me, did I disagree with one particular thing? And I'm thinking, no, I don't disagree with it. I'd written it. So I said, I'm not going to disagree with that. No, I'm fine with that. But this shows how people operating in the analytical world, whether in a university or as consultants in this sphere, can actually influence thinking. For me, it was a revelation. You do not expect policymakers sometimes to take these lessons on board. You presume that they commission reports and never read them. We all wonder when we write reports, is anyone going to act upon them? Does it affect anything in life? And one of the surprises for me was that it did, and that they helped shape those policies. That's not saying that the policies are right or appropriate. It's saying that they're based on accumulated evidence coming from these quarters. But life changes. Life changes. And what we have to do now is go from theory to practice to theory again. And I'll talk now about going from practice to theory. And from policy practice, my recommendations at the end of that particular exercise, that although there were a large number of steps which had been implemented in the policies, that there was still humongous scope for taking on board, in particular, many of the lessons that Ben had pointed to in his paper. I only use one example there of differentiated sets of instruments to tackle one particular thing, smart specialization. But on all the other fronts, there is room for policymakers to experiment more, particularly on an international basis, given that many of the problems that we have now to face will need international solutions. And there's also a need for policy studies. And the ones I identified at those times were these: a much greater focus on measuring, understanding scientific activities and policies and their impacts. We have lots of anecdotal evidence, not too much of it is very well systemized. We've made huge steps, but there are always more steps to make. A greater understanding on focusing on looking at knowledge flows, human mobility, career patterns, of understanding what the interactions are between all the science, technology, innovation actors. Again, lots of evidence, but systematically approaching these things. There's always new things to look at. And a greater focus on how we actually do tackle huge societal challenges. And these became sort of leitmotifs, which I was suggesting within commission circles. and not just me, loads and loads of people. This was the thinking at that time. Now I want to talk about the OECD a little bit, from practice to theory, but I will continue the thread. But for some of you, you may not know the OECD very well. Mr. Cameron calls it a Parisian think tank. It's a little bit more than that. It's set up really as a global forum in which governments can discuss a huge range of issues, not just science and technology. It's broader than that. It's every topic which governments have to think about apart from defence or national security or cyber security at the moment. But no, it is to cover, it's the way that governments can actually talk to each other in a sort of relaxed fashion. One of the things which has always marked sort of OECD interchanges has been almost a sort of so-called Chatham House set of rules, where people talk fairly openly in a way that they cannot usually talk in many international settings. 10, 20 years ago, the difference between going to a European Commission type meeting and an OECD meeting was dramatically marked. In one, it was read political statements. In the other, it was much more sort of academics and sort of academic policy makers having wonderful interchanges. I would argue that's altered a little bit the other way around, but trying to alter it again. But it's a source of data, statistics, and analyses. This is the core of OECD work, providing these kind of analyses. And it's structured internally in terms of directorates covering the usual sort of ministerial type subjects. And to the external world, what the external world sees is not the internal functioning. It sees a set of committees and working parties in different areas. Now, in terms of the one that I'm responsible for the Committee on Scientific and Technological Policy. At the same level there are other committees which are part of my directorate, which relate to other issues. ICCP is concerned with information, computing, communication technologies. CIIE is the Committee on Industry, Industry, Innovation and Entrepreneurship. But there's one in the middle called CSTP, and this consists of working parties. Now, I'm showing you here, you'll see this says 2015, and we're not there yet. But when I arrived in OECD 2 years ago, there were essentially 9 bodies there, which was too cumbersome, and there's a restructuring, and this is the shape which will be formally in place come January of next year. There'll be a global science forum, which concentrates obviously on that end of the spectrum. There'll be a new working party on biotechnology, nanotechnology, converging technologies, which combines 2 working parties at the moment on bio and nano, but the convergence area is of huge interest. So we've combined those. There is a classic innovation and technology policy. Some people will note, why do you not call it ITP rather than TIPP? This is one of the functions of living in Paris, where the French rearranged the names for us. And there's NESTI, which is the National Experts on Science, Technology and Innovation. Those are the 4 working parties, and there's 2 programs, International Futures Programme and the Space Forum, which are not affiliated bodies. Now, I'm referring you to this because I want to look at where you fit in. Because you are all the red blobs at the bottom. Because all of those structures operate. Each of these, if we look at them, the Committee on Science Technology Policy is government representatives, 34 member governments now, plus observer countries, plus partner countries, etc. So the meetings, since each country brings 1 or 2 people, tend to be about 100 and sometimes 110, 120 people. All government representatives, so sometimes they will bring their experts along with them. The working parties themselves composed of government representatives at different levels with different foci. And some of them are at even a higher level than those on the committee. So the TIP ones, for example, tend some of them to be in higher positions in the hierarchy than some of the CSTP ones. The NESTI ones tend to be specialists in statistics. Down here you have how these working parties work, because they have work programs and they have They set up workshops, they have studies, they have secondments, they have visiting fellows, they have interns. These are the operational level. And this is where the contacts begin with the policy analyst community. And this is where the input arises. Because all those inputs go into this setting of what we call the PWB process, the setting of our agendas. So there's an input from the analysts during all this process. And what we do during this now is we take these bottom-up ideas from the working parties. They propose particular projects they want to do over a 2-year period. Now, they propose them, and it goes up to the committee for consideration. And during this whole process, the working party suggests all these themes, which are largely the result of the workshops from the analyst point of view. But we have to put them then into a different kind of context. It's not just that everything that the working party suggests is done. We have to take on board what are the top-down OECD themes. Now, these sometimes come from ministerial decisions of the 34 countries of what are going to be the big themes which OECD should be looking at. And there are also the directorate themes. We have to encourage interactions between the different committees, etc. So I will talk in a minute about one program which we'll be doing, which will involve working closely with the Information Communication Technology Committee and with the Industry Committee on the future of manufacturing. So there's lots of things we have to take in terms of evolving what are our research agendas. And this was the result of the exercise when I first arrived 2 years ago. This process had been going on before I arrived there. I just had to, my job was just to put it to bed when I arrived there and to structure it. And you might notice some similarities with the issues beforehand. With the same titles here, impacts, SCI interactions and societal challenges. This is a reflection not of how much I'm able to influence these things. This is a reflection of the fact that these were circulating in the policy-making community at that time. These were genuine concerns, and they put forward sets of projects under these headings, with another layer here of underpinning elements, which are the heartland of what OECD does in terms of compiling databases, statistics, analyses, country reviews, and its flagship publications. So that's the shaping of that. And I'll look at this next. This is what we, so these themes, another way of looking at this, again, this is just duplication actually. But if you think of innovation system, and this is a way of thinking about how that work program is looking at, because one whole set on impact is all about system effectiveness. There's another set which is looking at system efficiency, another which is looking at the system relevance to global challenges, and there's a system measurement element. So this is the culmination of years of thinking in systems terms. And the process we've just finished this time, well, we're not finished, we're in the middle of it, but we've just had the big meeting of CSDP the week before last. And this is how they are structuring things this time as a result of this process which has gone through. This is what I want to focus now in terms of the research agenda, which is suggesting now, because these are a research agenda where we're confronting the challenges which policymakers think are the important ones they should be focusing on, or that the OECD should be focusing on over the next 2 years in the first instance, but they're likely to be longer. The impacts, capability and challenges areas really map onto the 3 areas that we've just looked at. They're a continuation of these trends in a way. And then we were asked to, and the foundations is the so-called underpinning element in the last one. But there's a new concern with futures, a new concern with looking ahead and really putting an element into the research program which has a greater concentration on foresight type activities, on policymakers themselves developing their own strategic capabilities. And these are the kind of things which they're looking at now, which are the current research agenda, which in essence, this is where I believe that policy analysts should be thinking and looking and understanding that these are what policymakers in the 34 probably richest countries in the world see as their policy, they see them as the concerns which an organisation like OECD should be looking at. That doesn't mean they're necessarily the most important. It means that they think the OECD could add value in these areas. And what I am doing now is talking to different policy analyst communities to say, A, whether these things will inspire their research in these directions, or whether they radically disagree and they see new directions, alternative things which bodies like OECD should be focusing on. Classically, measuring the activities of researchers and the impact of science policies. Again, this is the classic focus on impact. We're looking at changing patterns here, particularly careers of doctorate holders, looking at career development patterns, on mobility patterns, etc., on information flows and how policies in different countries have affected these. The incidence and impact of tax incentives and other policy support. In a world where we're thinking of policy mixes, there's a lot of talk about the balance between direct and indirect policy mechanisms, between tax incentives and more direct support for particular types of initiatives. And until lately, we've had lacked a lot of evidence on what the balance has been between these type of mechanisms. And OECD has built up now a database with the compliance of all its member countries on their use of R&D tax incentives. And we'll be developing and further developing that work so that we get a better understanding of what works well and how well they compare in a quantitative way as well as a qualitative way. The key enabling technologies. Again, we've started some work on looking at these hotspots developments. It's a more difficult task than just collecting sort of data on typically R&D patents, etc., for all scientific developments, to focus on just a few where particularly the boundaries are sort of variable between particularly now biotechnology, nanotechnology in areas like synthetic biology. But we're trying to develop ways of doing that so we have a better track of what we think are technologies which will alter the way we think, act, will alter our world enormously. And if we don't track them now, we've got to start tracking them now. Just the same as we had to track software when it first became realized that this thing called software, which no one knew what it was, should be tracked and monitored in some kind of way. Satellite technologies, this is another area which one group, the Space Forum, is looking at. The talk I gave yesterday was really looking at how important this particular sector is for us and will be in the future. So we're focusing on that a little bit more. Capabilities, this is really looking at the interactions within innovation systems, how the actors alter. And there is a big interest now across all the OECD countries in it. The knowledge triangle is a often used and sometimes misused word. All it really is a shorthand for describing the kind of actions there are between the research communities, education communities and innovation communities. And in particular what we'll be focusing in here in this programme is looking at the link between not the university sector research and innovation, but the university sector, the educational side and innovation. This is entrepreneurship programs, what universities can do in stimulating innovation directly rather than via the research element. We'll be looking more broadly at this root knowledge triangle and looking at all the factors which are affecting all the relationships between these different types of actors and how they in turn affect the performance of overall innovation policy systems. Now you can see this can be fragmented into lots of different ways, but we're trying to take a larger overview of how these many changes like sort of open science, changes like the increasing autonomy of universities, many changes which are affecting all the actors, how they build together to affect overall innovation system performance. Benchmarking place-based innovation policy systems really means that we know that there are spatial aspects to innovation policy, to the location of R&D, to the location of clusters of innovation development. And we know that those are operating rapidly. We don't know really the links between policies and those developments, either within the clusters themselves, what really is good practice and how do you measure it, or increasingly between the links between different clusters. Because we're moving into an area now thinking of constellations rather than clusters, and the links on an international scale, and sort of virtual clusters. So we'll be moving into work in that area. Innovation, inclusiveness and development is really where the OECD has said we don't just do work for the countries which are members. We're always expanding membership, and at the moment it's a rate of about 2 every couple of years. So there are 2 new countries going through the accession process at the moment. There's 2 still in the middle of it and 2 more coming in. So within 5-6 years there should be about another 6 members. So we're looking really at here. I mean, we know that innovation is important for economic development. What we can't say, though, is that the benefits of that always trickle down to everybody. In fact, we know they do not. And whether innovation can be a tool for increasing inclusiveness, decreasing the disparities between different sort of populations, is something that we need to look at much more closely. We see lots of elements which call for concentrations of excellence, etc., which has regional repercussions. But does in the long run this have very differential effects on development of different regions, or is there a balancing out in some way? The other 2 here are very general. They were put forward by the Global Science Forum. There's a reason that they're not as specific as the others, because the Global Science Forum historically has been a very bottom-up thing, so it just has broad titles for what it does, and then lets its members operate. That's changing slowly, but its focus is about how to cooperate better in science, in particular technology areas, particular research areas. Historically, it's been concerned with large infrastructures, so it's the CERNs and the astronomy labs, but that focus is changing. And the developing better institutional process for science funding is a very hot topic at the moment, because it's about scientific advice. The case in Italy last year of scientists being sued, jailed, has caused worldwide ripples. And so there are now work which is going on looking at what are the implications for scientists giving advice. And the other side of that too is really a much closer examination of the whole concept of evidence-based policy making. So those are aspects which will be increasingly of concern. The challenges which we have, the societal challenges, global challenges, there are too many for OECD to concentrate on all of them. It has to focus its resources. I was surprised 2 years ago when the challenges area was downplayed in the prioritization process we went through, and countries did not really see it as a very important area for OECD to be concerned with. Now that surprised me greatly, but what I found out afterwards was the reason why, and that's because of the 34 countries that are in it. There's about 20 odd which are members of the EU. The EU has a huge focus on societal challenges, and essentially the EU members of OECD were saying, no, the EU's tackling that, we want OECD to look somewhere else. It's another reminder that what OECD does isn't just all challenges, all problems, it is what those particular countries see where OECD can add value. But system transformation through innovation, this is based on the premise that if you're really going to alter innovation systems to meet societal challenges, sometimes you will need changes which are not just the result of individual innovation. You will need systemic changes of infrastructure. You think of transport, and you think of the nature of the changes that you will have there. You think of energy, of moving from oil, gas to, well, if you were going to be idiotic, you'd move to biofuels, but if there are other ways that you can move. But huge system changes in what we do. Next, global challenges. There's a big current focus on dementia. The G8 summit last year, focusing on Alzheimer's. Huge pushes from big drug companies, which is not surprising. Their model of innovation has ended. They are searching for new ways of structuring and doing things. They're putting pressure, as they only can, on organisations like OECD to have a big focus on Alzheimer's. We're saying, no, the problem's wider than that. We are looking at biomedical innovation broadly, neurodegenerative diseases broadly, because it's not our job to focus on particular items which are just of concern to the large drug companies. We are interested in the kind of governance changes which have to be put in place to tackle a broader range of issues than that. Okay, this is quickly towards the end. Global challenges, addressing them, that's mainly about food and food. Oh, sorry, you're interrupting me just when I was saying, could say something interesting to Eric. This is all about sort of synthetic biology and food. This is the new world after GMOs. This is super GMOs. And the challenges that we face there. So I expect sort of Eric to sort of put his hand up there and say something. Quickly, we're having a big ministerial in 2015. This will be focusing very much on these areas of impact, of capabilities and international cooperation on societal challenges. Blue Sky is something we're mandated to do by ministers every 10 years to look at new indicators that are needed to measure some of the phenomena we've been talking about. This particularly is where organisations like SPRU can have a huge input. What do we need to do in terms of indicator development? And this one I will talk about for a while because this is going to be a big one across many of our committees. When you're looking at the next industrial revolution, you know that technological change is going to affect the way we make things. You know that biotechnology, nanotechnology, converging technologies, you know that 3D printing, all of these are going to alter the way we do things, what manufacturing looks like. And you'll get huge changes on the supply side. If you think in bioeconomy terms, you've got huge changes in what your raw materials are going into manufacturing when you run out of coal and oil. You've got alternative sources for minerals and metals, which you'll be turning to the oceans rather than the land to do. You've got huge changes happening there, which we'll be focusing on. And we'll be involving directorates across the OECD in this. This will be a big focus for it. And future of the ocean economy is one part related to that. The rest I won't talk about because I'm rounding up now. These are the big publications, the flagship and the Outlook and the scoreboard. Many of you will be familiar with them. I had lots and lots of slides to show you from them, but there's no time, and it's good because I wouldn't remember what I was supposed to say to them anyway. The innovation policy country reviews, which we do as a matter of course for different countries when they pay for them, and then the basic data infrastructure. Now, we have a beauty contest every 2 years when policymakers vote on which as they see them. You will have this list here to think, does this influence your research agenda? This is what policymakers sent with as most important. For them, they really want the big flagship publications. They want the data that we do. We know these always come top of there. But underneath you start getting the themes which they think are important. So the HEIs and the knowledge triangle, enhancing the performance of national innovation systems. These are the kind of things which come top of this particular list. If you look here, this is what the SDI cover looks like. If you're going to search for it, this is what the scoreboard looks like, came out last year. And this should be the bottom 12. I copied and pasted from the last and forgot to change it to the bottom 12. But the ones I put in blue are there to indicate something rather special about why these are in the bottom rather than the top. Because the top ones are all primarily funded by the core funding which governments give to the OECD. These are all projects where they would have to put extra money in. So you can see why they don't figure quite as highly there in that list. Okay, I will stop talking there because I want to turn to you. Because in essence, I would argue the OECD provides opportunities for policy analysts to influence policy making. Historically, it has done, and quite frankly, the role of SPRU in particular has been amazing over the years. Right from the start of SPRU, right through, and it continues to be. I have an ex-student of SPRU being donated to me by the Korean government starts work in 2 months' time. I have 3 members of staff now who've been through SPRU at different times. I'm coming back here and they're all saying, say hello to people here, okay? And now, I'm saying to you, if you are really interested in shaping the world, I've always told my students, my employees, spend some time at the OECD during your lifetime. You will make amazing contacts. You will be able to access data you can't do anywhere in the world. I gave a TED talk last week called Confessions of a Spy. And really it was a walk through my personal life and how basically I've been privileged to gather information from different quarters. One government pays me to gather information on another government. Now I'm in the mecca for spies. I can access information everywhere. So this is what I am in my element. You could be too. We're always welcoming interns, visiting research fellows in any shape or form. SPRU people will always be welcome. Thank you.
For that fascinating tour of the OECD and European science and